today I will talk about some of our recent research on productive dialogue for teacher learning. And the findings that we have until now are pretty recent. So this is probably the second or the third time that I've talked about these findings in a more a conference type of setting. So I'll do well. What I will do today is I will start with say something about argumentation for student learning, as that is where most of my research has been up till now, and it's still going on, but just to give some framing, and then try to explain to you and to me why I moved to teacher dialogue and instead of student dialogue. And I will compare the two research fields, which I think might be interesting for you if some of you may be new to the field of teacher dialogue, because it is a relatively new field in any case, and you may be more familiar with the research on student argumentation. And so I thought that comparing the two research fields would be nice and useful. And then I will end with presenting some of our recent findings, empirical research into teacher dialogue. And the teacher dialogue that I will be talking about will be in settings that are school-based, teacher-led communities of practice or of learning. Okay, so let's start with argumentation, which I think is a more common field for most of you, or I'm assuming, maybe, hope, I think so. Yeah, I can see some smiles, so probably it is. Good. I have done research in argumentation and reason dialogue as a vehicle for learning, and as you know that, well, most of it, though, I mean, almost all of it is focused on student learning, based on this premise that when students reflect upon, explain, and articulate their own thinking and reason about it, when they clarify misunderstandings, when they are challenged and challenge other views, they process the content of the dialogue better, and hence they learn more or deeper, or these better learning gains afterwards. And then when the focus is on the teachers, it's usually as the one that's supporting that kind of process and those kinds of outcomes. So the focus is on support of student argumentation. In 2016, we published some kind of a review where we say, okay, let's take stock of what we know, what's the evidence for argumentation as something that promotes learning outcomes. And we kind of made the argument, well, we made the argument that a lot of the research, and I think that is also something that Christine mentioned yesterday in a more general focus on dialogue, not particularly argumentation per se, but that a lot of the research focuses on argumentation and has like a circular argument. Well, we see that people are learning in the discussion, so they must be learning something. So there's a lot of research that just focuses on the argumentation itself and how kids do it, and then make the assumption that they must be learning something. And we made the argument that in order to figure out what kind of argumentation, what features of argumentations are good for learning, we have to combine it with some external learning outcomes, which seems to be basic sense in any empirical research, but doesn't happen maybe often enough. And when you do that, you can actually find some patterns. And we made the case that there is actually maybe not enough, but still sufficient research that shows that when you tease apart the types of learning outcomes that you could look at, or that people have been looking at, you can see patterns with regards to the type of discourse that are more supportive and that are less supportive of learning a particular learning outcome. And these are just some examples, but the idea is that you have to be specific, you have to combine and be very specific about the learning outcomes, and not just say, oh, argumentation is good for whatever, because it's not for whatever. It's good for certain types of learning outcomes, and it's less for other types of outcomes. And also you can see some patterns with regard to the types of dialogical processes and types that are more supportive or less supportive of learning. And then when you know that, then you can also tease apart, well, what are the prerequisites, the conditions that promote that kind of dialogue, that promotes that kind of learning gain. So if you tease that apart and you are very specific, you can actually learn a lot, and we know actually quite a bit about what types of argumentation are good for learning and how can we make kids to engage more in argumentation of that type of that type of argumentation. Okay, well, yeah, so after some years I found myself studying teacher dialogue, and this was new to me, so I'm not an expert in teacher professional development or theories about teacher learning, and in the beginning, we started this about 5 years ago, I joined the group of people that were studying this 5 years ago, and it was all pretty new to me, and I was trying to figure out, so, okay, so how is this different, and what do we know, and what's the type of research that is already out there, what kinds of methods do people use, and what do we know, what are the theories? Well, let me first say something about why this move, why this interest. There are several trends that we can discern in literature lately that have led to this point that a lot of researchers right now in our field, in the field of professional development as well, are interested in teacher dialogue. And I've tried to put them on a slide. So the first one is that there's a shift in interest in teachers as learners in general. Whereas, also in my research, usually teachers are considered to be the agents of change, or the hurdle for change, depends on how you conceptualize the teachers, the inhibitors of change. But they're not really the object of interest for researchers. It's what they will implement in the classroom so that we can study the students. And this is a nice quote from Kennedy, who is an expert in this field, and even she's wrote like only a few years ago, that education and research is at a stage in which we have strong theories about student learning, but we do not have well-developed ideas about teacher learning, nor about how to help teachers incorporate new ideas in their ongoing systems of practice. And this was kind of surprising to me, this was new to me, but I could identify with it in my own research, because I have never been really interested in the teachers and how they learn, and I just want them to get to do what I want them to do, right, as a researcher. So it is a general shift in interest, and you can see it also in the granting agencies, especially in the US. A lot of grants nowadays are more geared towards figuring out how teachers learn in the workplace. From another field that is more sociological or more like administrative, educational administration, educational leadership kind of literature, there are studies that show that school-based professional community and collaboration are associated with instructional improvement and with learning outcomes, with student achievement, and usually more like standardized tests that they look at. So it's the atmosphere of collaboration and community, like some kind of like, okay, we're learning our profession, we want to improve our profession, and features of that kind of atmosphere that are connected, that are associated with better student gains. So that's another field that adds to that. Then within the professional development literature, there is, in the last 20 years, there's a lot of publications about the dissatisfaction with the returns, with the outcomes of formal professional development programs that are led by an expert. They're off campus, usually in a center for teacher development or something. They're like disconnected with the classroom practice. You learn something and then you send back to implement it or something like that. That's the basic model for most professional development in all countries. There's a question mark here, I'm not sure about it. You tell me. And instead, there's a rising interest in more like workplace-based professional learning communities. I really like this quote by my colleague Adam Lefstein, which is just out in educational research, in a paper he wrote about this, where he says that has to do with the theories of situated knowledge. So if you want teachers to implement the ideas and talk about ideas and implement them in their practice, you should bring them as close as possible to their practice instead of separating it and distancing it from their practice. And once you accept the idea that a workplace-based learning in communities of practice could be a good alternative for professional development, then researchers will be interested, okay, so what do the people do in these communities? And what is the more productive interaction? What is less productive interaction? And for those who are familiar with the collaborative learning literature for students, it's so it's collaborative, it's peer-led, in this case teacher-led. There's a lot of autonomy. So once we are interested in whether collaborative learning of this type is effective also for teachers, we want to do more research and find out, okay, so which processes, just like in collaborative learning literature for students. And then, of course, there is the advances in the field of student learning that show that participation in well-structured dialogue is productive for learning and for cognitive development. So they kind of take their inspiration also from, well, our field, from that field. And the first studies have been very much inspired also by models of what is productive dialogue for students and kind of like generalized to what's productive for teachers. Okay, so, but if we compare these two states of empirical research, teacher dialogue research is very new. It's very nascent, and there are not that many studies, and the ones that exist are mainly in-depth qualitative case studies or comparative case studies that show a lot of insight, but are not necessarily generalizable. Very good. And in recent years, there has been a call for more comparative research, like compare different situations, compare different designs, and using more quantifiable methods to be able to reach more general conclusions about what works and what doesn't. There are a few out there. The ones that do exist, they're usually, so the ones that do exist and focus on teacher dialogue and are quantitative or comparative, they're not in the setting of workplace learning. They're in the setting of formal professional development. For example, Miriam Sharon's studies about video case analysis in communities that are off campus and are expert-led by an expert facilitator, and that are focused on a particular topic. For example, how to improve my math teaching of fractions. So it's top-down. There's a topic, somebody's leading it, and it's off campus and it's formal. So I'm not sure whether the findings from those studies can be used, or we can assume that this also works in the workplace settings. So if I'm going to use that schematic, the schema that I used before to plot the research, what we have. So first there is the productive pedagogical discourse. What does it look like, and then what is the research that we have that shows that it leads to teacher learning, or the theory? And then what are the enablers and the inhibitors of that kind of research? This is the same schema that I used before for student argumentation. There's one notable difference with the argumentation literature and the dialogue literature is that there is no consensus or no standard way of assessing how teachers, or what teachers learn and how much they learn. So there's no common agreement, there are no common tools that are used, often they're not used at all. So there's almost no research that shows or that connects between features of the dialogue and then some external teacher learning outcome. Could be anything, could be a practice in teaching, it could be some knowledge test. If it's about fraction, you can ask about fraction, how to teach fractions, I don't know. But it's usually not used, and also this is a big void in the PD literature. And it's not because people are lazy, it's very difficult to conceptualize and to come up with very practical tools that can be used in different settings and across countries. We don't have any standardized tests for teacher learning, basically. So we don't have really any external empirical evidence to show that what types of teacher dialogue are better for learning. But then we do have we have quite a few publications about what productive pedagogical discourse looks like, and it's usually more the circular argument or based on norms or what we know from student argumentation and student dialogue. So it's based on logic and based on other findings from other fields and based on expert experience. So there's a lot of people that have a lot of experience in professional development and kind of know what works and what doesn't. It hasn't necessarily been empirically checked and tested, but they have a lot of experience. and bring that to the table and publish about it. So there is actually quite a good model of what does good dialogue look like, and there's a pretty much consensus in the literature about what it looks like. So the people that write about this, if you read across them, this is what we did, you find there's a pattern of some particular features that kind of return. And these are the features. We call it collaborative inquiry into practice. This is one word, one term to call it. But if you look across the different publications, case studies and theoretical publications, then we can, there are several features that recur. One is that it's rich in pedagogical reasoning. That sounds very familiar to people that are interested in argumentation. So that's reasoning, and it's focused on pedagogy. So it's not only, people are not only, the teachers are not only just remembering or stating what happened in class, but they're reasoning about their decisions about what they did in class. And why, and how could it be different? And then it's multi-voiced. There's representations of different perspectives. So you look at an instructional moment and a decision from different perspectives, and maybe consider different options, different alternatives that you could have taken, but you didn't. Which is also familiar from argumentation, right? About the social atmosphere, there's a lot of, it has to be in an environment where there is mutual trust, that is collaborative and is supportive. And at the same time, this is the next bullet point, it is inquiry-oriented. And this is a nice way of saying, well, we also expect disagreement. This we know also from the argumentation literature. Yes, it should be critical and it should be dialectical, but it should be in a collaborative and a supportive atmosphere, constructive atmosphere. And then here's one that's very specific to teacher dialogue. About content. So yeah, there's no curriculum, so we don't know what they're supposed to be talking about. So, but there are several experts in this field that have talked about the importance of the instructional triangle. That in teacher dialogue there is mentioning of teacher actions, and there is clear evidence of teacher agency, where teachers are agents of change, what they're doing. There's a focus on student thinking. I think Elisa mentioned yesterday, noticing. This is another way of saying noticing, that they pay attention to what students think and why they think and how they feel, how they interpret what's happening in class. And also there is some reference to content, to what they're teaching or what they're supposed to be knowing. And this combination of these three elements are considered to be very important. And this could be on any topic. It could be on fractions, it could be on motivation, it could be on whatever the teachers decide to talk about. But this mentioning of that content-wise, that they combine both teacher action, student thinking, and content, disciplinary content, is something that experts in this field consider very important. Okay, so this is the ideal. Now there are, especially Ilana Ford and others mainly in the United States, have studied how do teachers in these school-based work groups actually talk, and these are the more common patterns, which is more like the opposite of what we saw before. There are norms of teacher privacy and non-interference, individualism rather than collaboration. Okay, everybody. There's a hesitance of sharing what happens in my class, the problems that I encounter, and then also, so there's a problem of sharing them, and there's also a problem. There's also an issue of there's a lack of exploring them. So even when they share them, it doesn't lead off very often to a more inquiry-oriented exploration of the problem of practice. And instead, what happens often, I mean, I'm saying often, it's based on case analysis, is normalization of the problem. Yeah, that's normal. That happens to all of us, you know. Our tips and tricks sharing is like, okay, this is your problem. Okay, I'll have a solution for you. Do this and do that. Oh no, I have another one. Do this and do that. And so it's more tips and tricks sharing. And then from other studies, they also documented a lot of venting. Like it's like venting. You're like, yeah, it's so difficult. I don't know what to do either. Yeah, this is such a difficult job, you know. And so, which is important. All these things are important. I'm not saying that they're not important, but they are happening together with a lack of reasoning and inquiry into practice. So that is one. The issue that people, that experts in this field have highlighted. One of the issues another issue is that a lot of times the talk is like very general because the teaching and the problem of practice happens in classroom with the closed doors, the doors closed, and we don't have any way to actually see it happening. So we're talking about something that happened, so we're relying on somebody's story of what happened. And when you lack the details, sometimes it's difficult to really explore the issue. So there's a lot of talk about that we need representations of practice, detailed representation of practice within these workgroup meetings to make more like a deeper and more exploratory reasoning possible. And then recently, Donovan Weiss, who's one of my colleagues in Israel, has published several papers about how teachers avoid face threats, and there are like social dynamics in place where when you share your problem of practice and you're actually showing your difficulty and you're sharing your difficulty and how teachers then react to that. And for example, she shows how a lot of times when somebody shares his problem of practice, we get a lot of sympathy and a lot of empathy, but not really an exploration, okay, so how can we solve it? Some social dynamics that are in the way of more inquiry-oriented dialogue. Okay, so this is all based on a literature review. So what about the third one? The prerequisites, the enablers and the inhibitors of this more productive, the type of dialogue is considered productive. And I'm going to name it right now productive pedagogical discourse, and I'm going to assume that we all know that this is based on normative publications or normative norms and qualitative descriptive data, but not on empirical evidence that has shown that it leads to better learning. So we're assuming it's more productive based on what we know. Okay? So then, once we know what productive pedagogical discourse look like, so how can we make sure that it happens more often and that we don't fall into those traps of venting and tips and trick sharing and just sympathizing but not exploring solutions. And here the field has been interested in or has mentioned that we should look into, for example, the representations of classroom practice. If you bring video, the ones that is most, that if anybody is working here in professional development, one of the things that is a general recommendation is bring video case analysis. And bring videos of the classroom practice and analyze them together. Right? Reflect on them. It brings in the details and you can reflect on what's happening. And pay attention to students more than when you're teaching to particular students or to certain students. Then there's the question of how to design them. What is better, if I show my own video or if we look at somebody else's video? And based on the research from my colleague Donovan Weiss, for example, we could assume that bringing your own video invites more face threats than discussing somebody else's video. So actually, the general recommendation is that you should analyze your own practice with your colleagues. But to be honest, it makes sense that actually it could be better to analyze somebody else's video because you would be more free to think about different options, be a little bit more critical maybe, those kinds of things. Then we can look at the effective team meeting protocols, like protocols what you should be doing. And activity types, because there are different things that you could do in a team meeting, and this is what I will present to you today. Then there are questions, who should facilitate these interactions? The leading teacher, which is like one of the teachers, equal status, but has the job of leading the group, or it should be a coach, like a mathematics coach, or it should be the headmistress, would recommend that one. Or there are different options, who should be the facilitator. But what should the team compose of? Who should be on the team? Should it be based on disciplines, so all the math teachers and all the literature teachers, or should it be general, different teachers together, focusing on, I don't know, motivation or something? Just more like across the disciplines. What models or skills of teacher leadership are needed to lead these groups? And what kind of facilitation styles are more effective? The style of facilitation, the dialogue, which we know a little bit of for teachers, but who are facilitating student discourse, but not necessarily when you're leading a discussion with your colleagues. Maybe very different types of styles that may be effective. Organizational issues about payoff, the time allotment. If there is one prerequisite is that you have to have 1.5 hours in the schedule freed up for this kind of thing, maybe every week, every 2 weeks. Seems very small, but very significant prerequisite for this to happen. And there's also people that are looking into this more like the schoolwork environment. Again, so this is what should be studied. There are some studies out there, but again, few of them are comparative. They're more like descriptions of case analysis, and then those that exist, most of them are informal PD settings. So there's a lot of research about the benefits of video case analysis, but it's almost always in an official, formal, professional development setting that is in a center for professional development, not in schools, and led by an expert. So we're not sure whether this works the same way in school settings. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk is a research that, I wouldn't even say she's my collaborator, maybe I'm her collaborator. She's my PhD student, Miriam Babichenko, who's leading this research with me tagging along, basically. And I'm going to show two studies, a quantitative and a more qualitative study, the outcomes, where we study the conditions to elicit more productive teacher dialogue in school-based, teacher-led work groups in schools. And our goal was to use a quasi-experimental quantitative setup. So far so good, but then we found out there are no systematic coding schemes out there that can be used to quantify the dialogue. So we had to first develop a coding scheme, which took, I think, 3 years. So yeah, it took 3 years to do that. So I'm going to present it actually the other way around. So first I'm going to present you the development of the coding scheme, and then the research that we could do once we had the coding scheme. The context of this research is there is a reform movement in the entire country in Israel, where the Ministry of Education is allocating funds per district to start and support school-based communities of learning, so work groups that are teacher-led and in schools. We've been working with 2 districts, the central district, which is not Tel Aviv, but everything around Tel Aviv, more the central district, and the southern district. And in each district and each project does it in a different way. So we have our own way to do it, and other universities that got different districts, they did it very differently. In our intervention, in our program, what we did, it was, we started, I think, in 2014, and it went on until last year, is that we focused on the leading teachers. So a leading teacher would be an assigned, a chosen teacher in the school by whoever, by the team or by the headmistress, or it's up to them, and that will lead these communities. And our professional development was focused for these leading teachers. So the leading teachers, there could be 2 or 3 in the school, depends on how big a school is, they will come to off-campus professional development sessions every 2 weeks for 3 hours. And this was where they got materials and training and knowledge and theory about how to lead a community of learning. So it's about facilitation styles, what kind of activities can you do, how to deal with, they go and try something out, they come back. So the formal professional development was focused on the leading teachers. The leading teachers in their schools, they had the autonomy, and the school had the autonomy to adapt and to choose whatever we gave them as they saw fit. So they didn't have to use our materials, they didn't have to use our protocols, and there was no requirement that there should be at least 6 teachers or from this topic or disciplinary. The schools had the autonomy to decide how to compose the teams and what they were focusing on and when they meet. The only criteria was that they had to meet, they had to have a 1.5 hour free time in their schedule to meet. Okay, so we worked with the leading teachers and they went ahead and did whatever they thought would be necessary in their school. So it was adapted to the local needs of the school because we thought that if we interfere too much, once we're gone, nothing will be left. So it had to be something that had to support their own issues that bother them within a particular school, and that they had the freedom and the autonomy to fill in these 1.5 hours as they saw fit. So we had this data set, this generates a data set with a lot of variance, a lot of variability. But we thought it was crucial for it to last and to be scalable, so that it could grow. Now I'm saying a bigger we. This program is led by the Lab for the Study of Pedagogy at Ben Gurion University, which are our colleagues, and they're leading it. The 2 main persons that are directing it are Professor Adam Lechstein and Dana Leder-Weiss, which are both at this is a huge group. I lost count, and like 40 people or something. And we had a particular, me and Miriam had a particular job within this group that we were in charge of the quantitative stuff. All the other ones were doing our implementation and development and more qualitative research, which is more their forte. Okay, so within this program there's a lot of research going on. There's a lot of different types of studies. I'm just going to focus on ours. So first we had to develop a systematic coding scheme. Like I said, there are some studies that have conceptualized. There are actually a few studies that have proposed some coding schemes, but they were all used for the more like formal professional development settings. Our main data set for this particular aspect of the research, we used the data that was collected between 2015 and 2017. There were about 150 teams that participated in the project. 110 were Hebrew speaking, 40 were Arabic speaking. 78 teams were approached for data collection. We only approached, for this particular research, we only approached the Hebrew speaking because we don't speak Arabic. And only 78 were approached based on location so that we can collect data. So it was like, if a school was very far off the map and there were no trains and no buses going, we couldn't send a student to collect, so we didn't approach them. Of these 78 teams, 60 agreed to be audio taped. They were from 34 schools, different schools altogether, mainly elementary, but also some middle school. This yielded a data set produced a data set of 215 recorded team meetings of about 60 to 90 minutes each. Okay, when we started, the coding development process was pretty basic, how you always develop a coding scheme, I guess. Well, with this exception that, we didn't have a lot of predecessors to build on. So we went basically to the literature, the more like conceptual literature that conceptualizes what good teacher dialogue looks like, and then we tried to operationalize them into variables that you can measure. And then those we applied to random samples. We compared the coding outcomes to the definitions and to each other. And then we found out, a lot of cycles that it wasn't really that easily translationable, the conceptual definitions to the operational definitions that we could quantify and measure reliably. So there were like a lot of cycles that went into these. It took about 3 years, and a lot of people that, well, they didn't die on the way, but they left on the way. They said, okay, I'm done with this. And one person standing in the end was Miriam, and she came up with a codifiable, with something that was codifiable, and it is I think works well. So what are the main challenges that I think? Well, this was interesting because also Miriam but also myself, we had experience, or we have experience with coding student dialogue, whether in class or in small groups. So what are the main challenges and the differences that we found? Well, first of all, there was a very high diversity in settings across and in teams. So there were different, sometimes the headmistress was present, came to visit, and then the dialogue went to a completely different direction. And sometimes there were different team formations. Sometimes it was very specific on mathematics. Sometimes it was very general. There were differences in norms, in goals, and routines. And then, in addition to that, because it is an informal dialogue with colleagues, there were very, very fast shifts in topics. So there wasn't like, if you think about a teacher-led discussion, the teacher knows what she wants to talk about, and she has a plan, and there is a topic she wants, and once you say a kid says something that is off topic, it's usually, well, yeah, that's true, but that's off topic, and we go back to the main topic. But here we don't, there's nobody that's deciding what's the right topic to talk about. And even if the teacher leader, or the leading teacher, decided she wants to talk about X, well, they don't have to comply. They can direct it to another direction, which they did a lot. And because it's informal, so it wasn't like there was a very clear turn taking, people raising their hands. No, it was like everybody's talking together, and they're changing, and they're splitting up, and it's coming back, and we had a lot of difficulty finding out if we wanted to use our regular codes for reasoning, which is always making an argument, there is a counter argument, and we have a challenge here, and those didn't work. It didn't work because for that to work, you need to know what is the axis on which you are comparing it to, and what is the main claim that we're discussing right now. What is the main issue? And the issue kept on shifting like every few minutes, very, very quickly. So that was for us as researchers of learning discussions of students, that was very different. I'm sure that if Selma was here and anybody who's been studying argumentation in the wild, she said, yeah, well, why are you so surprised? Okay, and then another challenge was that we used only audio-based recordings, because a lot of teachers did not want to be videotaped, and so it was difficult to know who was speaking. We could recognize usually the leading teacher, but then the different participating teachers, we could not reliably recognize who was speaking and identify them. So we had to consider it as, okay, the group is speaking about something. So it's going to tease apart. Operationalization issues. Like I said, there was no clear canonically agreed upon standard to compare it to. So we don't know what they were supposed to be talking about, so we had issues of deciding whether we couldn't use our regular types of argumentation coding for this one. And there's a lot of within the conceptual ideas that we tried to operationalize, there was considerable overlap. So for example, one of the features of productive teacher dialogue that's mentioned in literature a lot is collaborative reasoning. Pedagogical reasoning, I'm sorry, it should be pedagogical. So this is about the reasoning, about how you talk, but also about what you talk about. So these are two things that are not really separated within literature, or the issue of problems of practice. So one things that people agree upon a lot is that when teachers discuss and explore problems of their practice, that is more conducive for their learning, is that this is about reasoning, so you're problematizing something. It's about critiquing. It's also about practice, so it has to be something about what happened in a classroom. So these are different aspects that once you code systematically, that you have to tease apart. Another issue was that there were no clear boundaries of complex conceptual discussions. Again, the problems of practice. Say the problem that I share with you is that I'm not succeeding in half of my class does not understand fractions well, and I don't know what to do. So that is the problem. But then very quickly it shifts to another problem. So okay, so what is the problem? It's the kids. Did they not have a good teacher the year before? Did they not come prepared? There are a lot of learning issues, learning ability issues. So it shifts all the time. And when does a problem of practice end and a new one starts was very difficult and basically impossible to decide. Which is something you have to be able to do if you want to code more systematically. Then some of the categories were very high in frequency, like reasoning. So reasoning happened a lot. So I think about like over 95% of the units of analysis that we used, they showed some reasoning. But it was very basic reasoning, just as what we talked about yesterday in Christine's talk. And then other ones were very low, so low that we could not establish reliability, some of the topics that we looked at. Okay, let me give you the good news. Okay, after I've been venting about the difficulties. This is what Miriam and all of us who collaborated with her on this finally came up with, or this is what we settled on. These are the categories that are codable reliably after extensive efforts and a lot of categories that we had to omit because they were very important, but they just weren't codable in a reliable way in a data set that is very diverse. And once you start coding teacher dialogue in school settings, you have to be able to deal with a lot of variability and the diversity, because it will all be about different topics and there will be a lot of differences. So we could code, there are 3 dimensions. It's the participation dimension, the epistemic or the inquiry dimension, how do they talk, and the content dimension, what do they focus on, and what do they talk about. The ones that was very easy was the participation patterns, a very high reliability. We can discern between whether it's just one person talking within a unit of analysis. Our units of analysis, I didn't say anything about, they're about 1 minute of talk. I can say more about that if you want to know how we arrived at that, but that's the unit of analysis. Whether 2 speakers are talking or multiple participants are talking within a unit of analysis. And we came up with something that came close to engagement. This was a difficult one. So for example, how do we know that the group is engaged and they're involved, they're participating very lively, say that way, is when there was a lot of back channeling. I don't know whether you're familiar with the term back channeling. Back channeling is when I say something and then, for example, Antonia agrees with me or does not agree with me, but she doesn't want to interrupt my turn. She goes like, yeah. Okay, that is back channeling, and this is codable. Overlapping speech when other people are talking. In our setting in Israel, that's a good sign. That's a sign that people are engaged. It's not rude. So this is maybe culturally specific. Or when you compliment each other. When I say, yeah, it's like, and then somebody says, yeah, it's like yesterday. So you can compliment each other. It's not only interrupting. It's also complimenting each other's turns. And then a negative sign of engagement would be parallel conversation. People just go off and start talking about different stuff in different groups. That could be rated on a scale from 0 to 4 and yielded to reliability. The epistemic inquiry dimension.
So we didn't code for reasoning because it happened so often, and it was like a non-issue. I mean, but asking for reasoning appeared to be a more better sense of looking at how much reasoning was going on, or how the extent to which people were probing into each other's ideas and asking for reasons why they think the way they do. Asking for clarifications, we could code disagreements or challenges, and referring back to others' ideas. It is like you said before, you mentioned this, and I think about it something else. With regards to the content focus, again, we could code this triangle, this instructional triangle, the aspects of the instructional triangle. So whether the teachers talked about teachers as actors who have agency, and their actions, or they intend to act, or their actions in the past. Whether they refer to the student perspective, to how students perceive, or think, or believe, or feel, and whether they mention disciplinary content. It was impossible to code for topics. Are they talking about the parents? Are they talking about the leadership? Are they talking about books? Are they talking? It was impossible. Okay. So. Now that we have this coding scheme in place, we could start looking at what are the enablers and the inhibitors of more or less productive teacher dialogue according to these criteria. And we looked specifically into the choice of group activity. Now, what do I mean with group activity? Oh, you maybe see something else on me? Oh, okay. Let me show you. For example, if in one team, like say the science teachers team in a school, they have decided that they will do, each teacher in every class will do one project of project-based learning. Okay, and they found that it's difficult to implement. There are several difficulties that the teachers would like to talk about. You can think about different activities to enable the discussion about these difficulties. For example, you can decide to plan one of the lessons together as an activity that would support each other, and it will elicit reasoning about why you do this, why you shouldn't do that. You could also, as a leading teacher, decide to analyze a video case from one of the classrooms and analyze it together, and then make sure that several issues are picked up on and discussed. You could also ask one teacher to describe one of the particular problems that he's dealing with, and then consult with the others as an example of difficulties, which is also a representation of practice that is often common. Or you can bring an article about a project-based learning and then discuss it. And these are just 4 options. Okay? So you can do different activities that all have the same purpose of eliciting pedagogical discourse that is inquiry-oriented. And most of these are described in the literature as productive activities, or potentially productive activities. So in our study, like I said, I mean, we gave in the professional development for the leading teachers, we gave them tools and options, and they practiced with different types of activities. But we left the choice to them which one they would use, and they could choose not to use any of the ones that we gave them. So we went to the 215 team meetings that we had in our data set and divided them into activities, because in one meeting usually there are like 2 or 3 activities. Not all of them focused on pedagogy. Like the beginning is often technical, logistic, coordination, and this is something that we will not be looking at. And we found that there were 7 different types of activities in total that these teachers used. And this distinction about what activity they chose to use, and was based on the instructions and the descriptions that the leading teacher gave at the beginning of an activity. And it was really clearly marked. Okay, so now we're going to do this and this. We're going to watch a video. Mariah has a video from hers, and we're going to do this. Okay, that's the introduction of the leading teacher of the activity that on the basis of which we decided what activity they were doing. And we selected a subset of the bigger data set for fine-grained coding. We wanted to, first of all, only to consider activities that were described as productive in the literature. Okay. That were frequent in our data set. We had to have enough. And that were from different teams, so that the same team would not end up more than once in each category. And that were at least 5 minutes long. Most of them were like 20 minutes. But they had to be long enough to be substantive. And the activity, after applying those selection criteria, the three activities that we decided to focus on were the collaborative analysis of video, so video case analysis, which by a team member. So we only focused on the ones that a team member videotaped herself and then brought it to the group. Peer consultation. Peer consultation is also an activity that the teachers got from the professional development, where a teacher prepares a case, gives a lot of detail about what happened, and then presents it to his fellow teachers to consult about this issue. And another activity that happened quite often, which was not part of our set of tools that we gave the leading teachers, was co-planning a lesson or co-planning a pedagogical activity, like a fair, a science fair in school, or things like that. Okay, so co-planning a pedagogical activity that's meant for the students. So those were the three. And actually in the literature, the ones that get the most praise and is mentioned most often is the video case analysis. I mean, it's like there's a broad consensus. This is just a very rich representation of practice that elicits very productive dialogue among teachers. Well, did it? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to show you tables first. This is the inquiry orientation dimension, so the epistemic dimension. How do they talk? There was asking for details, asking for reasoning, connecting to previous ideas and disagreeing, and an overall inquiry score based on these four. So what we see first of all is that on the overall inquiry score, actually the video case analysis activity yielded the lowest. So the teachers that were analyzing a video of one of the teachers in the team actually showed the lowest indexes of inquiry compared to the other two. And there was no difference between. There was a difference between the video case and the co-planning mainly. So the highest was actually co-planning, which was one of the activities we didn't even include. And when you look at the more detailed pictures, you can see that it is mainly because of the asking for details. So there was much less probing into each other's ideas with a sense of, I don't understand, could you say more about that? Could you explain that a little bit more? Those kinds of probes. And there was less disagreeing. So there was much less challenges or differences of opinion and disagreements in these dialogues compared to the co-planning. So actually the co-planning was highest on inquiry orientation. What about the focus on the instructional triangle? Again, we have here the teacher actions, student perspectives, and the disciplinary content. And whenever within a unit of analysis the teachers refer to at least one of these three, it would be considered pedagogically focused discourse. Any unit of analysis where they did not refer neither to the teacher actions nor to the student thinking nor to disciplinary content would be non-pedagogical discourse. So it could be about anything about the headmistress or about the parents, about all kinds of things. And here we see actually that, so the lower indexes are the ones that we want. So we want less non-pedagogical discourse. And actually the video analysis activities yielded less non-pedagogical discourse. And the non-pedagogical discourse was highest in the peer consultation. And if you look a little bit more into these details, not all of this is significant, especially the disciplinary content. But we can see that it's mostly because within that a lot of times, 59 means that since 60% of the units of analysis, the teachers did not mention at least twice, teacher actions, either in the past, in the present, or in the future. So what you can do, or what you did, or what you should be doing as a teacher, which I think is a concern. Okay, so so this was kind of surprising, in a sense that the two activities that are considered in the literature to be particularly productive, which is the video case analysis and the peer consultation, were not very successful in a different way. So in the video analysis, what we saw that the main problem was that there wasn't a lot of inquiry orientation, there wasn't a lot of disagreement. And when there was a focus on pedagogy, there was a focus on the teacher actions, but not a lot on the student thinking. And this is also one of the reasons for using video case analysis is because in the professional development settings, like for example, the Shireen and Vanessa studies, it shows that teachers pay more attention to student thinking when they watch a video. And actually, in our case, we saw that they were pretty low on student thinking. Miriam conducted some further qualitative analysis, which she's just writing up right now. And when she focused, she tried a lot of things. She took a more grounded approach, and she looked at different features of what happened in these discussions, in these dialogues. And in the end, found that there was a difference in activity goal framing. So even though the activity was video case analysis, there was a considerable variability across teams about what was the goal. Why are we analyzing video? And in a third of the cases, there was no clear goal discernible. So yeah, we're going to analyze video. Let's do it. But there was no clear goal for why you would be doing that. When there was a clear goal, the most frequent one was actually to advise and to provide feedback to the presenting teacher, which is counter to what in the literature video case analysis are used for, is to explore what's happening in classroom. So it very quickly turned into a tips and tricks sharing, because I have a problem, what should I do? And only in one case there was the goal of the activity was framed on let's look at student thinking, let's look at the students. So not enough to do just the activity, we have to pay more attention to how the goal of the activity is framed within the group. And in the peer consultation case, the problem was that overall it wasn't very effective in supporting collaborative inquiry into practice in general. But in particular, that the teachers were not positioned as agents of change in these dialogues, in these activities. And again, she tried different ways of looking at the data and came up with there was a very clear difference in, again, how the goal was framed. And in this case, a diagnostic framing of the problem of the practice. I presented my problem, I presented the practice and the problem that I want to be talking and consulting you on. And in most cases, about 70% of the cases, the problem that was selected and that was presented was actually a problem of teaching. So you could say, well, then how can they not be talking about the teacher and what he could do if the issue is the teaching? And so that wasn't it. What was the problem was how the cause of the problem was framed. So in most cases, immediately after presenting the problem, it was reframed by the presenting teacher or by the other teachers as a problem of a particular student, of an inherent problem of a particular student or a group of students that could not be changed that easily. So for example, here's an example from one of the protocols. He is a very slow student, very, very slow. If you let him, he will work on a test for 5 hours. He's very anxious. He is diagnosed, but he doesn't have a psychodidactic or a didactic diagnosis, only a psychiatric one. He is diagnosed with an attentional disorder, and he was treated with some type of medical treatment until a month ago, and this continues. And in the work that she's writing up right now, she shows a detailed case analysis of how this very quickly turned into a dialogue about how the parents are not taking care of this learning disability, and how it's actually there, and the more the psychological support that the school gets, it's their problem, and it's not something, it wasn't framed as something that we can do something with, or we should do something with, or in that sense. So, and that was 2/3 of the cases where where the problem of practice was an issue of teaching, was immediately or very quickly reframed as a problem of somebody else, not as something that we can solve as teachers. Okay, so, oh, right, got that one. So in conclusion, I think that I've tried to map a little bit about how a dialogue for learning in classroom and classroom and in the staff room is different and the same. There are some differences. There are also some similarities, which I guess mean, well, it could mean two things. Either the field of teacher dialogue is too much heavily influenced by the models we have for productive dialogue in students, or because it's the same type, it's basically the same elements of dialogues that are good for learning for both teachers and for students, which is also a probability and a possibility. But I guess we need external evidence to really tease it apart. I think the contribution of the empirical studies that Miriam led on this issue is that we have managed to develop a reliable, generic, and a relatively comprehensive coding scheme. Some things are still missing there, of course, but it's workable right now. So we can start working with that and maybe ameliorate it, improve on it, add things on it later. We have done first steps to quantitatively analyze and compare designs to facilitate teacher discourse. And we found that I think that in addition to that, what the literature says should work very well, we didn't find it worked very well. I think it's also very important to remember that what works well in effective PD, what works well in PD, in formal environments, you cannot just take that and automatically assume that it also works well in the more informal and the teacher-led environments. Practical contributions, well, yeah, I think, well, it's too early to give any recommendations. I mean, there's just a few studies there right now, so pay attention to framing, yeah, okay. Limitations, well, there are many limitations to our own work, and this is the baby steps, the beginnings of, so there are many issues that we should and could improve on. But one of the basic issues, I think, is we should figure out how we measure teacher learning so that we can combine and compare the types of dialogue with the learning outcomes, and then figure out what is actually productive teacher dialogue. It could be something completely different than what we think it is. Our further research, Miriam is working on a next study where she compares the differences between the videos of a teacher from the team versus a video from somebody outside of the team to see what's more productive. And in our new project, we started 2 years ago, a new project in Israel where we are trying to implement dialogic teaching in elementary school language arts, Hebrew speaking for now. And actually the PD model that we use is the professional development model is the learning communities model, where we again support the leading teachers, and then the leading teachers go into the schools and establish their own learning communities, and it's more autonomous in that sense. So we're not very top-down with our professional development. So this not only will yield interesting questions with regard to the implementation in classrooms and things like that, but also about models for teacher learning of dialogic teaching. So dialogue for dialogic teaching. Yeah, it's a little bit of too much dialogue here, but okay. So thank you very much. If you're looking for any of the papers, they're on my website, and if you're interested in the publications from the studies that I presented now, they're under review. So if you're interested, you can send us a mail or send Miriam a mail, send me a mail. I will pass it on to Miriam, and we can share some versions of it with you if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you.